Good morning, everybody, and welcome to a wonderful conversation today about the Amistad. And I'm Sally Whipple. I am the Executive Director of the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House, and it's our pleasure to host this conversation today. The Amistad is a very important story for the Old State House. Right now, we are all sitting in the room where the trial started. In this room, you have to imagine a courtroom packed with people. If you're familiar with Pearl Street nearby, the Amistad Africans had been held in the jail on Pearl Street, walked up to the State House, and brought into this room. And sometimes this just seems like an ordinary room to me, but a lot of times I come into this room and I can feel the power of those moments. I can feel the power of Sengbe Pia in this room with his fellow captives from Africa, waiting to see what would happen. And I also think about the people who were so engaged in this trial, people who were filling this room, filling the balcony, and teaming outside in the yard, trying to look into the windows to see what was happening with this trial. It was a very powerful moment for the Old State House, for Hartford, for Connecticut, and for the world. And the story didn't just happen in Hartford. The Connecticut story happened in New London, in New Haven, in Farmington, in Hartford. It spans the state, it touched the world. And we are so lucky to have so many of these sites preserved today and on Connecticut's Freedom Trail. And today we're really here at the suggestion of Lieutenant Governor Bysiewicz to really celebrate Connecticut Freedom Trail Month, a month where we recognize the buildings, the sites, the places, the memories that have been preserved in Connecticut so that we can honor, remember, and really reflect on the stories that happened here, the stories that made Connecticut the state it is today. So I really am grateful to have all of you here. I'm very grateful for the Lieutenant Governor for suggesting this program today, and I'm going to let her lead the panel, and I hope you all enjoy this experience.
Thank you so much, and Sally, thank you so much for hosting us in this beautiful historic spot. Thank you to those who are attending in person, and thank you to all of those who are part of our virtual conversation as well. I'm honored today to be joined by a fantastic group of expert panelists. We have Tammy Denease, Connecticut Freedom Trail Outreach Director. We have Andre Keitt, Connecticut Storyteller and Educational Consultant from the Farmington Historical Society. We have Paula Mann-Agnew, Executive Director of Discovering Amistad, and we have Charles Warner Jr., Chair of the Connecticut Freedom Trail and member of the Amistad Committee. And joining me today in the role of co-moderator is Mariana García de la Noceda, Public Programs and Exhibition Manager here at the Old State House. Our historical sites are what help us keep connected to our past, and the Connecticut's Old State House is really the keeper of the key to the past that unlocks the history of not just our state, but some really significant historical events that happened in the early American colonies. In March, I was sitting at this same table, and we were having a discussion with members of the General Assembly and Connecticut residents about the witch trials that occurred right here in Connecticut. And there were residents of Connecticut that were convicted and hung right here in this spot in Hartford. And our Old State House witnessed this site was a place where there was a witch hanging, the first in America, and it was 55 years before the Salem witch trials happened. So one of the central themes that we're going to be talking about today, and the same debate happened on the floor of the State House and in our General Assembly when we were talking about the witch trials. Why should we care about the events in the past, and what do those events mean for our future? What's important about those stories today? And so I hope that we're going to have a great conversation. I know that we have these fantastic experts. And as Sally touched upon, our panelists are going to talk further about what happened with La Amistad, and this was the very site of the trial. And the trials were, at the time, back in that day, really the subject of not just the state's attention, the state of Connecticut's attention, but people were paying attention all across the country and around the world because of what it meant for slavery. And this story is really at the heart of slavery, abolition, discrimination, and civil rights right here in Connecticut. And we are having conversations about social justice, equity, and discrimination every day here in our state. And so this is going to be a fantastic discussion, so we should just get right into it. So we are going to start, and what I want to ask each of our panelists is this: why and how was the Amistad Committee established, and how did it lead to the creation of the Freedom Trail? So is there anyone who would like to start? Okay.
No, I think Charles.
Charles?
Sure.
Go ahead, Charles.
So, some citizens in New Haven were interested in commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Amistad incident. And so, a group of active citizens got together and sort of reconstituted the Amistad Committee to lift up the story and really remind the community of Connecticut's historical significance, but also to raise up this issue of human rights. And so out of that, the committee stayed together and led the way for creating the Connecticut Freedom Trail, because so many towns and cities across the state had a part of the Amistad story. New Haven doesn't own the story, certainly the state of Connecticut does. And so many interested parties had a piece, and they wanted to lift the story up, and so they united to do that. And I must say also that the Connecticut legislature and the governor then worked together in a bipartisan way to establish the Connecticut Freedom Trail.
Excellent. And Charles, tell us a little bit more. Mariana is going to ask you further about the Freedom Trail.
Yes, of course. And Charles, as a follow-up to that, how did the formation of the Freedom Trail contribute to the change in how we've learned and how we're teaching the story of the Amistad here in Connecticut?
It's very interesting. I think what makes it the Amistad story so interesting in regards to the Connecticut Freedom Trail is that each town and city across the state has a different piece of the Amistad story that touches, their locality. And so there's ownership across the state of those different pieces of the Amistad story. So it allows folks from all over to be connected and have a voice.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to just say a few things about New Haven's connection and New London and any other place that you'd like to mention besides this place that we're in?
Sure, and then of course, like our other panelists can speak up, but certainly New London owns a piece of the Amistad story with the Amistad being towed and stationed there. Certainly Hartford with the historic trials. Farmington, as Andre I'm sure will talk about, owns a piece of this story. And Also, you have to think that citizens from all over also donated to the cause of the defense of the Amistad captives. And really, I must say that the Amistad incident is probably one of the largest / earliest international human rights crisis. And so Connecticut was certainly in the forefront of leading the charge to support these folks and free them and then return them home. So the whole state owns a part of this story.
I love that. Let's ask Tammy, and then anyone else can feel free to jump in. And Charles sort of started to allude to this. Who are the heroes of the Amistad story?
The heroes of the Amistad story, everyone looks at Singbe, which he definitely was, but also the 4 children that most people don't realize were aboard the Amistad. There was Sera Magu, Keme, Kanye, and Gali. And the big part that the little girls played in the story was they helped the adults get out of chains, to get unchained. And that story is not told as often. So I think there's multiple heroes in the story, but I definitely think the kids need to be highlighted.
I love it when little girls are leading the way. And anybody else want to jump in with a hero?
I'll add to that. I think that in terms of the heroes of the story, as Tammy mentioned, it's kind of multi-tiered, right? There's the heroes throughout. I think what's really important and what becomes important in telling the story through the Discovering Amistad, the Amistad ship, and working with students is that many of the students, when they learn the story for the first time, they see young people of color as the heroes. Oftentimes in studying history, history is sometimes skewed or it's whitewashed, and so that in understanding something as significant as this historical account, the students are amazed. You know, Singbe and his peers were young people of color that their communities had invested in them. They were being trained to be leaders. They were strategic thinkers. And so when they found themselves in that difficult situation, they were able to work together. And so, I think it's important, young people of color on that ship, the heroes of the story. It was their resiliency and determination that encouraged the abolitionist movement to follow their leadership. Sometimes when we hear the Amistad story told, the leaders are kind of positioned as the abolitionist, kind of helping these poor young people, right? The reality is that it was just the opposite. It was because of what these young people did, fighting for their lives on the ship and fighting for their freedom in the courts, that the abolitionist movement really got started.
Anybody else want to jump in on that?
It's redundant to keep going over that.
Okay. Charles?
I actually would like to mention the free black citizens who donated their time, clothing, and money to supporting the legal defense of the Amistad captives. They're certainly heroes of this story. And citizens even outside the state of Connecticut, like Robert Purvis, who commissioned the famous Nathaniel Jocelyn painting of Singbe, PA, that was used as sort of a rallying cry and to galvanize abolitionists to support the defense of the Amistad captives. I'd also like to mention folks like the Reverend Simeon Jocelyn, a white Congregationalist minister who understood power and privilege and also duty to your fellow man who, may not be in the position to defend themselves. And, Roger Sherman Baldwin, the attorney, and so many others who rallied. And I think it's important to highlight that because this is a binding, uniting story that has, strong efforts on the part of black citizens and white citizens.
All right, thank you, Charles. So something that we've alluded already a little bit from the start, Sally was mentioning that this story just captured the headlines. Everybody was talking about this story. Could we go a little bit over, and this is for really everybody, how the conversation of this event was going on during the time this whole trial started in 1839 and went on until 1841 about. So what was the public, different groups of the public maybe, talking about while it was happening? How was that conversation happening?
Well, from what I understand, when the Mende arrived in Farmington, they were shrouded in a whole shroud of mystery. There was a mystique, and the mystique went down racial lines because, first of all, they came from the quote-unquote dark continent. So there were a lot of misconceptions, as they are today, about anybody that doesn't look like you. So when they got to the village of Farmington, people weren't sure what to expect. They were very surprised at the comportment of the Mende in court. They did not understand and see how truly extraordinary these people were. They didn't know that many of them had noble backgrounds. So there was some culture shock in the very beginning because of predisposed dispositions and, I don't know, prejudgment.
That's right. Even then, there were stereotypes.
Even then, can you believe it?
And Andre, tell us, aside from being part of the trials, what did the Africans do in Farmington? Were they having conversations? Were they visiting with the residents? What were they doing?
So they actually had, the men were going to school on a daily basis at Deming's store, general store, and upstairs is where they lived. They were housed in a really small room up there, and there was a lot of sickness because they were in close proximity. The girls were housed at different individuals' homes. Some of them did go daily for quote-unquote music lessons at the Deming's store, but they were actually being educated as well. So they were always doing something. They had plots of land where they could grow their own crops, their own food. They were taking care of themselves, and they were given a modicum of autonomy while they were there. So there were times that they questioned were they really free at all. But they did have their own plots of land. They could walk about freely and do what they wanted to do. Now, everybody in the village of Farmington at the time were not welcoming to them, but they did call it an abolitionist village. So that meant most of the people there were happy that they were there, were trying to be advocates, were trying to help them, but you're gonna find somebody in the bunch. And there are different stories. We have the letters where they did encounter some problems.
And did Farmington become an important stop on the Underground Railroad because of the Africans being there, or was it already important?
It was already an important stop, so this just added to that heritage. No, but they were busy doing that way before that. That's why they were known as an abolitionist village.
And interesting, you mentioned that the black girls were being educated, which is quite the radical idea. And that, was happening in, I believe, Canterbury, where there was a woman who decided it would be important to teach, and she was quite the controversial figure. So maybe that's why they were just saying the girls were having music lessons.
Yeah.
Because it's less threatening than educating those females.
They weren't stupid. They knew they had to.
All right, so everybody, so probably the most popular, definitely maybe the most wide-ranging version of this story is probably the Steven Spielberg film, The Amistad. I certainly first heard about the Amistad for the first time through the film. They would bring it and show it in class. But what does the movie represent to you? How do you view the film? Have you seen it, first of all? And what is your opinion about it?
Well, I have seen the film. It's very Hollywood. And what I like to tell people is see the film, but read the book, visit places that they actually visited. It's very Hollywood because, one, like I said, you don't even know about the children. It focuses on the legal aspect, and it also has the air of white savior. It doesn't really give Singbei and the other elders the credit that they're due for coming from a society or from a community that was teaching them leadership skills and how to survive. But what I will say that I do appreciate about the movie is it got us talking. It brought this story back to center fore. A lot of people like to give Steven Spielberg the credit. I give him second credit. The person that really deserves the credit is Miss Debbie Allen. For 13 years, she fought to get someone to tell this story. And Steven Spielberg eventually comes on. And I don't think she gets enough credit. And as a black woman in Hollywood, going against the grain, especially at that time, telling historical, heroic black stories was not in the purview, if you will. And she fought hard, and she put her career on the line to do that. So that's what I appreciate about the film, is how she fought hard to get it there, how the story has been brought back to center attention.
So my church is Center Church, First Church of Christ in Hartford, right down here on Main Street. And we screened that movie yesterday. And we did that because it was Connecticut Freedom Trail Sunday, and we wanted to revive the conversation about the Amistad, the ills of that movie, the pros, cons of that movie. And it was refreshing in that a lot of the people who came yesterday to see the movie had not seen it before. And I've seen the movie before, and it's really graphic, so there are times that I needed to just walk away from it. My father won't see anything like this because he said it just pisses him off, so he don't want to see it. But I watched it yesterday, and what I do a lot of the times, because I am a performer, is I read the room. You read the room, right? We all should read the room. So as I read the room during that movie yesterday, some people could not stomach, and they got up and walked out, and then went back in there because it was so harsh. Steven Spielberg did bring that story out, and we now can look at it unfold and see what happened. But it does center on the rebellion on the ship, and it does center on the case, but it does not talk about what happened once they were liberated. And that's where we take over.
Oh, do tell us what happened. Because I watched the movie, now I want to know.
Well, I mean, that's when they were set free in Farmington. They took sleigh rides from the New Haven area, Fairfield County area, to Farmington, and they were covered in blankets that were made out of fur. They were ragged. So that lends us to believe that their courtroom attire, which was pristine, must have been borrowed, because they arrived in Farmington just gaunt, raggedy. They had gone through a lot, but they were finally free. So they had their freedom, their liberation, but they had no funds to get back home. And that's where the story takes place, where they go around and they do different kinds of tours. They were very athletic and acrobatic, so they did shows. And you know, sometimes I think about the fact that they had to do these shows in a negative way, because it's akin to a minstrel show, and that bothers me a little bit. But you know what? Sometimes you got to take you know what and turn it into sugar. And that's what they did.
And so they eventually raised enough money for their passage back
Absolutely.
home.
Absolutely.
And I just wanted to add to that also in terms of what happened. When we tell the story on the ship, and you all probably know our ship is like a floating museum. It's a floating classroom, and when we tell the story, it's focusing on the story from a human perspective, right? So it's really being able to think about Singbei and the other 52 Mende and liken it to ourselves, right? So you think about being trapped in a human trafficking ring and leaving your family and not knowing where you are, what's going to happen to you, and fighting for your life. The reality is that for most of them, in their minds and hearts, they were fighting to get back home, right? That's what it was all about. It's like, I'm fighting, as Andre says, I'll do a minstrel show, I'll do whatever I need to do, which was dehumanizing. But I will do it because I want to get back home. Unfortunately, many of the Mende, when they got back home, because of the international human trafficking, the enslavement business, their family was not there. So just when we talk about the story, we talk about it from a human perspective, thinking you're going to fight, as any of us would, fight for our families to get back home, and then you get back home, and then your family's not there. Singbek's family wasn't there. His wife and his children were not there. And so the reason why this is important to think about is that it was an incredible victory that they were able to win the court case, and it's outstanding that that happened. But sometimes when we're dealing with generational oppression and racism, there are victories, but it's always important to remember that we're still fighting. You know, we're still fighting for freedom, we're still fighting for human rights, and then also to be mindful of generational trauma, you know, that impacts folks as they are fighting.
Yeah,
so,
our people
sorry.
have PTSD.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and that's our inheritance.
From centuries, yes.
That is our inheritance.
Yeah.
So,
But
you know,
that's our inheritance. The inheritance is also our resiliency,
Right.
and the
Absolutely.
victory that comes with it. So we have these victories,
Absolutely.
and so you asked the question about what happened after. It was incredible victory, but when you think about it from a human perspective, this historical occurrence changed this state, the country, the world. But it kind of did it on the backs of individuals that generationally are still impacted.
And so, Susan, when we see
Yeah.
current legislation going towards saying that African American studies have no value, I mean, come on. I don't take only just personal offense. I take homage for my whole race.
Right, well, and I'm proud to tell you that we now have a requirement.
Absolutely, I know about that.
And that's, yes, and that's good, and Doug McCrory fought hard for that, and Jerry Reyes fought hard for Hispanic studies as well. I wanted to go back to Paula for a minute. Why create a replica of this very cramped ship? What does it mean? What has been the purpose?
Yeah, so the ship was built in the year 2000 at Mystic Seaport and was supported by the Amistad Committee and many other entities. But the focus of it, it's really an incredible tall ship. It's an old wooden ship, but it's incredible. But for us, it's not a tall ship with a story. It's a story with a tall ship. Susan, if that makes any sense. Because the ship itself gives us a platform to be able to tell the story, right? So we can tell the story, and then we have opportunities to then look at the themes in the story. So as we're talking about now, we're talking about legacy, we're talking about dehumanization, we're talking about, civics, we're talking about making connections from the past to current day. And so when those that visit the ship have an opportunity to get on, they can, we guide them through a process where they can see what happened with the Mende, but at the same time, there's always this challenge. Sengbei found a nail, and he used that nail to help the Mende get free and fight for freedom. And the question is always, what do you have? What nails do you have? What are you fighting for? Because we can all be part of change, right? So the purpose of that ship is really to educate about the Amistad story, to have these courageous conversations. What we find most of the time is that people feel that they don't have safe spaces to talk about history as it relates to racial and social justice. This ship creates that for us. And it's an interesting thing that happens because so many parts of the state kind of own aspects of the story. When the ship, which we refer to as the freedom schooner, because it's symbolic of freedom, but when it pulls into a port, there's usually a lot of excitement and attention. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that people see that as, kind of symbolic of freedom. So that's why the ship was built, and we are committed to continuing to use it as that platform. We have about 16,000 people each year that come through the ship or are part of our freedom forums or school-based programs, but the core of it really is about the dialogue.
I wanted to dovetail on that. When Paula said these are courageous conversations, I just think when you ask about heroes earlier, I think everybody who's willing to have an open mind and open heart and have these conversations, that they themselves are heroes, because there's a whole contingency of folk lined up that don't want to talk about any of this. So the fact that we're able to do that and the platform is presented for folk to do that, and you have willing people that will talk, they're heroes.
Yeah.
I thought it was,
Governor,
go ahead.
about the creation of the ship, honestly, the idea started in the 70s when a man by the name of Warren Marr commandeered a boat for a regatta and put the sign of the Amistad on the ship. And it was his interest in actually recreating this ship. And so it was created with him in mind for sure, but the intention was to realize a tangible object that would be there for folks to be induced into conversation around certainly human rights, man's inhumanity to man, but also the redeeming parts of the story of what can happen when citizens are on the right side of history. And the Amistad incident, and there were really horrible parts, but one of the glowing parts is the way that citizens across the state led the fight for the release of the Amistad captives and to speak up on behalf of folks who had no voice.
Susan, have you been on this ship?
So I have, because when I was Secretary of the State, and I think it was in 2000, it was parked right over here, and we dedicated the Blue Book to the Amistad and its story, and we had people who came from all across the state to get on the boat and see it. And it's just so striking to...
Didn't the story come alive when you got on that ship?
Right, and you just can't picture how people could be packed in such a small space, and I'm very claustrophobic, so I know I would not have survived that. But Paul, I wanted to, you mentioned the word human trafficking.
Yes, I did.
Which struck me because, now, unfortunately, in our state, around the country, around the world, there is still human trafficking, and usually it is focused on women and girls, although sometimes boys and men are involved, and that struck me when you said it, because this is a fight that we continue to have today.
Yeah, and thanks for saying that. I think the reason why I use the term international human trafficking, it's because it's what the enslavement business was.
Yes.
And I think that sometimes when we study, the enslavement of Africans, it's studied in a very different way. I mean, it's thought about in a different way. And sometimes it's because of all of the justifications that have come up, around it. But the reality is that millions of people were captured, enslaved, taken from their families, and they lost their rights as human beings. And that was all a part, it wasn't just America, it was international. It was an international ring that made many countries very rich, including this country, right? That's part of what made us so rich, right? And so I think it's important to kind of call it what it is, because from a West African perspective of Sankofa, the only way that you could really understand what's happening today is to go back and learn from the past.
I like that you use that term, Paula, human trafficking, because it does just that. It humanizes for the centuries that we were just cargo. So you go from cargo to being a human is, by using that term, is wonderful.
I think it's also helpful because what it does do is also highlights why it's important to teach history and how subjects related to, different peoples have a through line. Black history is important not only to black people, but this issue of slavery and enslavement does connect to current day human trafficking. And I think by telling these stories, it's not just sort of reopening old wounds. What it should serve to do is give people a historical context, but provide you good eyesight to see what's happening now and then forecast what could be happening in the future.
Right. And Charles, I'm going to piggyback right off of what you said, and also Paula's idea of Sankofa, because as we've seen, the Amistad has become almost this mythical, legendary period in our history. So many details that people take for granted of the story might not be entirely accurate. So are there any misconceptions that you commonly hear people talk about regarding the Amistad that you wish to just dispel?
Yes.
From the conversation.
Yes, that the Amistad was a slave ship. And Paula referred to it the Freedom Schooner because, honestly, if you know anything about it, you can see that it was used for cargo. And the intention of the ship was not meant to be a slave ship. And so that's one of the kind of simple misconceptions. I think the other thing, when we talked about the young people being educated, they were educated in Hartford, in Farmington, but when they were in New Haven, the children were basically on a work farm that belonged to the Pendletons. So while they were staying at the Pendletons' house, for their sort of jail sentence, they were working. They were put to work without compensation. And so when they got here, it wasn't the end of a traumatic experience. It was the end of one part of it and then into another. So yes, the end of the story was sort of redeeming in a way, but their time in Connecticut was not sort of great and open and welcoming. New Haven and Connecticut have this kind of label as an abolitionist state. But Connecticut was also known as the Georgia of New England, where there was rife racism and anti-black sentiment here.
There was slavery in Connecticut?
By the time of
legally
the Amistad, it
abolished
was
in
actually still legal.
1848.
Slavery still existed in Connecticut. Well,
Until 1848.
Yeah, exactly.
So I have a question for Tammy, because you alluded to the Hollywood nature of the movie. So Tammy, if you could redo a version of the movie, how would you do that? Now I'm curious. You said that and I've been wondering.
Or a series.
Well, as a performing artist, I bring to life these historical women that are hidden in history, and one of the women that I bring to life is Sarah Magoo. And I like to tell her story because it puts the humanity on it. When telling the story, I actually started from Africa, from the beginning of where she came from, a very loving household, the beginning of her training of being a leader and things of that sort. So I start there and then I bring it through the whole story and take it all the way back. And it's so important to make sure that when telling these stories, we're telling it from the perspective of the individual who is the most affected. And so when I tell Sarah Magoo, I start off with just her simple introduction of, my name is Sarah Magoo, but before I was Sarah, I was Magoo. I come from a place that is warm and tropical. I come from a place where I was loved. Although we are not the same and we do not have the same blood coursing through our veins, we are a family. We are a village. And so I try to paint what the backdrop really is, even from the clothing that she wears to the accent, to try to make sure people really understand the nuances of what enslavement does to an individual and how it takes away and how it chips away, but at the same time, that resiliency and that determination to hold on to who you are at your very being, your very fabric, can still remain.
So in a future movie, can we see you as the
I
heroine?
would love to bring Sarah Margot to the fore. I would love to do that.
Telling her story.
Yeah, I would love to, but again, it's all in not what you know, but who you know. It took Miss Debbie Allen 13 years, and I've been doing this for almost 20.
Absolutely, and maybe Ms. Rhimes or Ms. Witherspoon is
Yeah,
ready to tell
Ava
it.
DuVernay,
Just
yeah.
saying.
Yeah, the state of Connecticut, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the state of Connecticut has any expertise in movie making, but it would be a great movie.
We can start somewhere.
Absolutely.
All right, well, I think I have one final question for everybody on the table. What do you hope the role of the Amistad story will be in the future, and how we tell history and how we remember history, and maybe in the future of the Freedom Trail?
I would like to see it continue growing in the positive nature that we've been able to do it, from it being the misconception of it being a slave ship to being the freedom schooner, to be able to tell the story from the perspectives of the individuals who were captured, who were taken. And I wanted to be able to continue in a positive vein of speaking to that resiliency and that determination, because a lot of times when our history is told, it is told from the perspective of enslavement, when enslavement really interrupted our history. It is not our history. And so to be able to connect to the Amistad story from the beginning, not from when they interrupted, but from the beginning, so that future generations can see the resiliency, the positivity, and not only see it as people who were chained or treated like property. Go beyond that, see the humanity, see the bravery, see the courage.
I actually hope that the Amistad story is a reminder to the citizens of Connecticut about our role in lifting up history and using it to change the world. We've done it with the Amistad story, and in this age of like contested history and facts and truth, I just want to remind Connecticut citizens about their power and the influence that this state has had in leading folks to reckon with history and hold up truth and really underscore the responsibility of having power and privilege.
I want to see Singbe Pia become an icon like Martin Luther King Jr. I want little kids to know who Singbe Pia was, and we can see these names in textbooks.
I think for me, what I'd like to see is I'd like the story to continue to be showcased as such the incredible story, the incredible historical account that it is. I also want to, I want it to be a reminder for all of us that we all can be change agents and have to be change agents, always remembering what Dr. King said about being a bystander. When you are a bystander, then you are not, you are aligning yourself with those that are not.
You're complicit.
Thank you for the word, Brother Andre, Deacon Andre.
Sorry.
No, thank you,
Not
being
sorry.
complicit. But I think that is really important because of the complicated history, our complicated history, many people feel immobilized, like they can't make change, they can't make a difference, their voice doesn't matter, but all of our voices matter. And I'd like to see the story continue to allow us to have some dialogues that helps to enact that in all of us. And in particular, I want to be able to support educators because they have the minds, they're molding the minds of our young folks. And for them to be able to have those dialogues that will free them up to teach in a very inclusive way. So I would love for the story to do that.
Lieutenant Governor, I'd just like to say that we should really also be thanking the Connecticut legislature and the government of Connecticut. The Freedom Trail is an act of legislation brought to the legislature by then Senator Tony Harp. And the legislature, and of course the governor's office, made sure that the Freedom Trail was created. And so we must underline good government and the benefits of what can happen when people are responsible with power. And so it's to the credit of the Connecticut legislature that we have the Connecticut Freedom Trail.
And I think the point of this discussion and some of the visits that I've been making across the state this month is to let people know what treasures we have, what amazing stories there are. I like to always think that I know a lot about women leaders in Connecticut, but I didn't know about two sisters who created a Black Wall Street in Bridgeport, and they were Black women, they were indigenous as women as well, and they did incredible things, and people don't know about them. And so that is the point of this discussion today, and we appreciate your helping us to highlight just one of the many stories in each. I think the goal is to have a place in each town and city across our state to highlight important parts of Connecticut history for the people of Connecticut and beyond. And so to that, I'm wondering if there are any questions that the audience that has been sitting here very patiently, if they have questions, or if we have any questions from our virtual partners.
Before we go, I
Sure.
wanted to make sure, am I on? I wanted to make sure to thank you, Lieutenant Governor, because of your exposing the Freedom Trail and bringing light to the Freedom Trail. It's making my job as the outreach director a lot easier when I go out into the community to talk to people, because it is helping to give exposure to the Freedom Trail. A lot of times people see the signs, but they're not really sure what the Freedom Trail is all about. And so by you doing what you're doing and helping us to get out there, it is making my job a lot easier to be able to get into the community. So thank you so very much for that.
Absolutely. Any questions from our audience? We have a microphone that's coming right over.
I had a question about educators in Connecticut and whether the story of John Adams' life is being interwoven with the teaching of John Adams. Has any story of Amistad connected with it? Is it interwoven? Does anyone know if educators in Connecticut are teaching John Adams with the Amistad story?
I don't know.
Presidential life, I guess.
Right now, I'm not sure if it's taught together, but certainly does offer the opportunity to discuss the life of John Quincy Adams and what sort of inspired him to really take up the legal defense and serve as an attorney, after such a distinguished career and major American political life. And if it's not, it is a wonderful opportunity for people to be creative and weave in John Quincy Adams' story.
All right, there are multiple movie ideas right here.
In the same vein, I wondered about Farmington Village. Is that story being taught to Farmington children?
So, I don't know. Okay, all right, here we go. I don't know about the curriculum in Farmington schools. I just started working with Farmington High School just recently. And I do know that for our portion of the Freedom Trail, our Amistad tour, we talk about John Adams in relations to the letter that Keitt wrote him. So that was a difference between the movie too, because in the movie, Sing Bay says, give us free, but Keitt wrote that in his letter to John Adams. So we have a little snippet of John Adams, but I think what I've noticed in the school system is when they're talking about presidents, period, they cover John Adams, but they don't give us what we need in its relations to Amistad. So maybe there's a gap right there.
Well,
As
I
you
make
said, there's a movie right there.
Oh, sorry. Well, I make sure that when Margot talks about the court scene and the representation, John Quincy Adams is definitely pivotal in there, as well as Roger Sherman Baldwin, or Baldwin Sherman. I always mix it up. But I do make sure that those two individuals do get some form of credit in the story in regards to the role that they played.
And is it the Roger Sherman who was the signer of the Constitution? Who is it different? Oh, Roger Sherman Baldwin. Okay,
Yeah, who's
got
the
you.
descendant.
It was
Interesting.
afterwards he became governor of Connecticut.
Yes.
Yeah, and something that I sometimes mention when I'm talking about the Amistad in relation to John Quincy Adams, after he was president, he went back to Congress.
Yes.
And something that strikes me is that congressmen were not allowed to talk about slavery. There was a gag order. Like anybody who wanted to even raise the subject of slavery, they really couldn't because there was a gag order. That was strictly a state's issue. So Congress could not talk about it. But I mean that John Quincy Adams wanted to raise the subject even though he could not.
That's a good question because it really, underscores the importance that political figures, elected officials have and the responsibility, but also the efforts that someone who had been the president of the United States involving themselves in such a big sort of controversial social matter, how important that was and what kind of light his involvement brought to the situation. How courageous.
The other issue, though, as a direct descendant of Venture Smith, we have a curriculum, we have a book that teachers can use to teach the Venture Smith story, and I just feel as though we keep doing, let's teach Hispanic, let's teach Black studies, but this is integrated history, and until we get integrated curricula, children are not going to be learning these stories. It takes integrated stories to be taught.
Well, that's why it's important that you're doing the work that you do and that we're all doing the work that we do, because certainly what can't be done in the time provided inside of classrooms is upon the citizens to make up for and fill in those pieces.
And it's interesting that you mention integrated story. It's all one story, but we've had to piece it together, but wouldn't it be nice if it could be told as one story? Any other questions?
Checking online, nothing.
I was curious what source material really sparked the creation of your performances and that were most helpful for you in creating that experience.
I worked for 4 years at the Connecticut Historical Society, and that was my first, that was my next introduction to the Amistad. It was a reminder of what Debbie Allen had started. And as an educator, I would give tours. They had a 5-room exhibit of the Amistad story, starting with the African room all the way to the court scene, and then making it back home. It took me a year to work through the emotional trauma of learning about this story and what they went through. And then I realized everyone was focusing only on the legal. They were leaving out what it was doing to the actual people who were affected. And so that is what, where it became an inspiration for me to do that, because again, history was being told from one lens, and I didn't want to play a role in that. I wanted to expand on that. And coming from descendants, as a descendant from an enslaved individual, I knew my great-grandmother, and she lived to be 125. So she was still very fresh.
Wait a minute, she lived to be 125?
Yes, she lived to be 125, and my grandmother was 107. She passed away in 2004. And so I knew these women, and to hear this story, it just reminded me of, wait, I knew someone. It wasn't just a story. This was my life. My great-grandmother told us stories about the Civil War and how she fed the soldiers and the horses. She told us stories about the Little Bighorn. So I'm literally 3 generations away from enslavement, and so I drew up on all of that, my own personal experience, and I knew that that story had to have a human touch to it. It had to be from their side of the story. And although I'm not from that area, I am still able to dig deep because of the historical trauma, because of what has been passed on, to be able to tell these stories and to tell them from a more positive light, if that's the right term, but from a more correct lens, I'll say that, from a more correct lens, from another perspective versus always one side.
And can you tell us, so your great-grandmother and your grandmother, where did they live? Where did they
I'm originally from Mississippi. My great-grandmother, what she would do is tell each of us great-grandchildren parts of her story, and so that we didn't forget it. And one of the things that she would always tell me was to remember the Marian season. That stayed with me all my life, and from time to time those words would come back, and I had no idea. So it finally was like I had to go look it up. And what she was telling me was she had received her freedom during the Marian season, which was between the age of 12 and 15. At that time, it was legal to be married at that time, between 12 and 15. And when she got her freedom, reparations of the day was 40 acres and a mule. And the enslaver, his son, hated the idea of slavery. So I guess you could say he was an abolitionist. He wanted to give her reparations, but she told him no, that in order for her to truly own it, she had to purchase it. So he sold it to her for $2 an acre. It took her 2 years to pay it. She got her 40 acres and her mule, and those 40 acres are still in our family today. So.
Amazing. Yeah. And what part of Mississippi? What's the town?
That's Columbus, Mississippi. It's the northeast corner. It's about 2 hours from the state capital, Jackson, and about 90 minutes from Birmingham, Alabama.
I think there's a movie in that too.
I'm working on my memoirs. I'm working on it.
Absolutely. Wow, what fabulous female role models.
Yes,
and are you sure she wasn't the oldest person to live? I mean, because
she wasn't, because there's actually someone I think that's alive now that's like 137 or recently died. It was close to 137, but yeah.
All right, I'm gonna have to Google that. Amazing. Well, I want to say thank you to our incredible panelists for joining us today to help us celebrate our Freedom Trail. We thank them for making our state more beautiful, vibrant, and just.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks to Sally and the folks at the Connecticut Democracy Center.
Absolutely.
All the
Thank
folks
you
at
for
Historic
having
Preservation and Economic Development. Thank you.